I was a real idiot when I was younger. I got hooked on Oxycontin, got in trouble with the cops, then ended up faced with two choices. Either go to jail or take part in a state-mandated rehab program called The Farm. The Farm was, unsurprisingly, a farm, and I'm guessing its owner had friends in high places because he managed to wrangle himself a deal whereby he could get himself all the dirt-cheap labor he needed so long as they were all troubled youths facing jail time. I guess that sounds real exploitative or whatever, but looking back on it, I'm not sure it was the farmer who benefited more. I guess I can't speak for the other kids, but working in that place sure as hell saved my ass. And sometimes I think it just might have been a stroke of genius sending us to that place, because picking up trash on the side of the highway is one thing, but seeing how putting time and love into something really can create something beautiful, it fixed a part of my brain I didn't know needed fixing. I made friends at the farm that I still talk to. Granted, it's on Facebook because we live at opposite ends of the country now, but the point still stands. It gave me discipline and self-belief, which is amazing considering I showed up expecting it to be nothing but baby jail. But then, I guess it's the irony of ironies that all of the crazy stuff I did on the street, it all kind of pales in comparison to something I went through at the farm. So when you first got to the farm, you were assigned a job and a roommate. Your job could be anything from livestock and crop management to irrigation or pest control, but your roommate was there for one purpose alone, to help break you into the routine and make sure you stayed on track. These roommates were ideal for the role because the system was working for them and they could talk from the heart about how it could work for the newbies too. And that's how it worked with my mentor anyway, and when it came time, I gladly accepted the role myself. I knew it'd be a challenge, and I'm sure I myself was a challenge when I first arrived, but I also knew that I had to give something back before I left the program and moved on with my life. Not everyone made it to mentorship level, and as cheesy as it might sound, I considered it an honor and a privilege. For the first time in my life, I felt truly appreciated and wanted to share my own appreciation in return. So around 9 months into the program, I'd risen to the position of livestock supervisor, and had been given my own 2-bedroom living quarters in preparation for receiving my mentee. Obviously, the dorms were very strictly divided by gender, so I knew my mentee was going to be female. But what I didn't know, and had no way of knowing until I met her, was how cooperative she was going to be. If she was chilled out, repentant, and receptive, then the next month would be an absolute breeze for me. But then if she wasn't, I knew things could get very rough. I'd already heard a bunch of horror stories and how troublesome uncooperative mentees could be when the rubber really hit the road, and in 1 or 2 classes, fights had broken out between the mentors and their roommates. I really didn't want that to happen, so my whole game plan focused on pacification and building a rapport between myself and my mentee. Pretty much the exact same tactic my own mentor took back when I first arrived at the farm. So, the day my mentee was due to arrive, I was actually really excited to meet her, and I wasn't in the least bit discouraged by her attitude upon arrival. Now, she obviously didn't want to be there, but very few did upon first touching down, so I understood her reticence and took it in my stride. Since I was still in livestock, she accompanied me on a few days' work with the animals after her induction was finished. And although she really didn't take to it at first, she warmed up with time and showed rapid improvement. She was due to be with me for a month, and the month could have either been very short or very long, and by about week 2, it was looking like it was going to be the short kind. Shauna, my mentee, was fitting and well, and although her attitude needed major work sometimes, we were making some major breakthroughs together. And then came the day that the cops arrived, 2 of them, and I spotted them talking to a very concerned-looking group leader. I walked over, mainly intent on listening in on what they were saying, but when the group leader spotted me, she called me over to talk. I found out the cops had driven all the way out from the city because they were looking for someone, and that someone just so happened to be my mentee, Shauna. They didn't just want to talk to her either. She had a warrant out for her in another county, and they were there to arrest her. Obviously, this kind of presented us with a very precarious situation because we didn't know how Shauna was going to react to all this. She could potentially be going back to jail for whatever she'd done, so if she saw the cops coming, she might just try and run. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time, and she's been so volatile at the beginning that no one could be 100% sure about what she'd do. But then, as we were thinking about it, I had an idea. If I could go and talk to her first and break the bad news, it might be received better coming from me instead of cops. I remember how, when I was on oxys, just the sight of a cop would give me major anxiety. And I don't know, maybe in another life I'd have made a run for it too. And all that progress, all that hope, so suddenly and cruelly being taken away. It was a nightmare, but one that was about to be Shauna's reality in the next couple of minutes, unless I was there to soften the blow. Once the plan was agreed upon, I walked off towards the dorms to where I was pretty sure Shauna was just kind of chilling in her room. She was right where I expected her to be when I walked in, and I sat down in the bed opposite her and told her how we needed to talk. I think she genuinely had no idea that that other warrant was out for her, because when I dropped the news, she was devastated. To say it was emotional would be the understatement of the century, and she actually did bring up the idea of just running off before the cops could see where she went. But then somehow, I managed to talk her into just going with the cops to see what the warrant was about, because it was better to face the music than run from it and make things worse. The thing that really seemed to convince her was when I asked her if she was 100% truly certain that she didn't know what the warrant was about. Then when she gave me yet another convincing no, I told her that it couldn't have been that serious. She'd remembered robbing a liquor store or shooting someone, but if she seriously didn't remember and wasn't blackout drunk when it happened, then it couldn't have been any worse than a missed court date or a traffic violation. Shauna calmed down a little, like, damn, you're right. And after promising that the group leaders would put in a good word for her so that she might be able to come back, she agreed to follow me over to where the cops were waiting. I remember how we were walking side by side after we left the dorms. But when we turned the corner of the community hub and the cops came into view, Shauna slipped from my side and started to drop back just a little. It was obviously just a little hesitancy on her part, but I figured we were over that and kept encouraging her. But when I looked back in her direction after she totally slipped from me, I didn't notice that she was reaching for something. But she must have been, because I looked back towards the cops and the next thing I know, there's a knife at my throat. I just froze for a few seconds, and feeling the knife to my throat was one thing, but realizing it was Shauna that was holding it was another thing entirely. I was completely blindsided, and all I could do was just stand there as Shauna held my head with one hand and the knife with the other, as cops drew their weapons and started to approach. Shauna started telling me to walk backwards, which I did, but I think the movement kind of kicked my brain into life, because the words, "What are you doing?" just started tumbling out of my mouth. I said stuff like, "Shauna, what are you doing? Shauna, think about what you're doing." And she responds, "I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to jail. I'm getting out of here." All the while, the cops are screaming to put the knife down, put the knife down. But all Shauna seemed focused on was walking backwards and not cutting my throat on accident. I remember telling her, "They're going to shoot you, Shauna. They're going to kill you if you don't stop." And she just yelled at me to shut up and keep walking, which again is what I did. Kids had come running to see what was going on because they could hear all the yelling. And so as we're walking backwards, almost hip to hip, there's this big gathering of kids all watching from near the community hub. And it was chaos. But I never once believed Shauna would ever do me any harm. It was just a desperate attempt to avoid going to jail, and as soon as she got to the trees over near the livestock fields, she was going to make a run for it. But that's not what happened. There was about a minute where I was trying to convince her to let me go, but Shauna was too busy trying to get the cops to keep their distance. She was yelling at them to stay back and all this other stuff, and totally ignoring anything that I had to say to her. But then there was this moment when she stopped, and it was like she came back to me for a second. At first, she told me to shut up again, but I kept telling her how what she was doing wouldn't work. If the cops didn't catch her on foot, she'd end up running from them on her own in a place where she was unfamiliar with. If she stuck to the roads, she'd be in cuffs within hours, But if she stuck to the woods, it'd be her versus the bears and cougars and Mother Nature. And I told her again, "This won't work, Shauna." And in reply, she told me, "Yes, it will, because they'll be too busy trying to save you than to chase me." I could write all night, I guess, and still not even get close to how terrified those words made me feel. And like I said, I was 99.999% convinced that Shauna meant me zero harm and had just panicked when she realized she was going to jail. But maybe she even remembered what the warrant was about and remembered that it was way worse than she first thought. Who knows? Not like she's around to ask her either. And the last thing she yelled as she intended to draw the blade of that knife across my throat was, "I'm sorry." But she didn't just say it, she yelled it. And I guess that was all the cops needed to hear. She yelled that apology and I felt the blood hit my face. But it wasn't mine. It was Shauna. After one of the cops heard her cry, took aim and pulled the trigger. I had a tiny cut where the knife nicked me as she fell, but other than that, I was completely unharmed. Shauna, on the other hand, was probably dead before she even hit the dirt. The cop put the bullet right through her brainstem, and there was a hole in her face between her nose and her eye. I just started screaming. Like I didn't know if I had been shot, how bad the cut to my throat was, because, like I said, it was bleeding a little and I was in a state of complete hysteria. I got down on my knees and started trying to wake Shauna up, like shaking her. I thought that there'd be a chance that she'd survive the shot. I mean, people survive crazy head wounds sometimes. But I think I just knew, maybe from the look in her eyes, that there was no more life inside her anymore. That day was the worst of my entire life. It's not something I'll ever get over either. I've just learned to live with it. I know Shauna had to die so that I might live, and I heard the sureness in her voice, and I know in my heart that she might have been about to kill me. But that doesn't mean that every single day I don't think about her and wish that she'd made a different choice.
To start off this story, this happened while I was in college. My sophomore year, I lived in the dorms and I was assigned to a random roommate. He seemed a little bit introverted but fairly normal at first, but he wouldn't really talk to me. I would try to start conversations about things he showed interest in, but he would only give me one-word answers that were obviously meant to end the conversation. I figured he probably just didn't like me, so I decided I would give him some space and leave him alone. After a few days, that's when it started. I would notice that he was always staring in my direction. I chalked it up to coincidence, but it continued happening. Classes started up, and I spent less and less time in the room, but whenever I was in there, he would be constantly looking in my direction. Whenever I would turn to face him, he would turn his head away from me, but it would creep me out since it was pretty much constant. I started noticing that he would lay on his bed to read, but he would always hold the book or papers at an angle that always gave him a direct line of sight to me. About a week or so into the semester, my girlfriend at the time and I went on a morning hike and crashed on my bed at around 2 p.m. We woke up to him just standing there staring at us about 2 hours later. He didn't say anything, just turned and left the room. It was at that point that I decided I needed to leave before he did something to me in my sleep. I got out of there pretty quickly. Fortunately, I didn't see him again for quite a while, but we ended up having a class together senior year. I had been telling my friends that story ever since it happened, and they didn't believe me. One of my friends had really poor vision, so we sat in the front row. Of course, every time I looked behind me, my old roommate was always staring directly at me. Not at the teacher, but at me. It didn't really matter if we were on the middle or on one of the sides. I challenged my friends to look back a single time during the semester and catch him not looking at me. Within 5 classes, they gave up, and they agreed that he was staring at me non-stop, and that he was indeed super creepy. My parents think he was in love with me, but I just think he was crazy. I guess I'll never really know what his deal was. So this happened at the end of summer of 2016. To give a bit of backstory, my boyfriend and I were both around 20 years old. So my boyfriend Max and I used to share an apartment with another married couple. Mind you, they were pretty awesome people. Unfortunately for us, Florida wasn't what they wanted, so they decided to move to Pennsylvania. Max and I started looking for people to replace them with because of rent, and it was pretty pricey, and we didn't want to have to pay for the whole thing all on our own. It was in a very nice area, but not close enough to the city, so most people that told us they would drop by to check the place out would flake out last minute. Eventually we found this person that seemed to be a very nice and laid-back girl. She then explained to us how she was looking for a place for her boyfriend Dan. Now, I tend to see people's auras when I meet them, and I always get a certain feeling when I don't like them immediately. I'm not a judgmental person in the slightest, it's just something I feel and can't help. I did not like this person straight off the bat, but I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt because everyone else seemed to be okay with them, so I thought I might be wrong, and I was hoping I was. As the time went by, said Dan started being super loud. He would invite people over on weeknights till 4 a.m. He would play music loud enough for it to sound like it was being played from our room, and multiple other annoying things, and also being beyond disrespectful, especially to me. Max wouldn't do anything about it, and I'm kinda glad because I know Dan would have wanted to fight him or something. Dan was 22 at the time, but he had the mentality of a 12-year-old. Side note, we later found out that Dan had some previous mugshots for shoplifting and other stuff. He also threatened to beat me up several times. Yeah, me, a 20-year-old girl. I just wanted to give you a bit of insight on Dan so you understand what is coming up. Buckle up. It was a Wednesday night, and I got home at around 5:30. As I was walking upstairs and almost to the 3rd floor, which is where we lived, I saw him coming out of the apartment, but I don't say anything because we don't like him, so I just mostly ignored him. He then started yelling at me and telling me to look at the apartment. I looked inside from the doorway and I saw nothing wrong, so I asked what he was talking about, and still in an angry voice he claimed that he had been robbed and that he had also just gotten home to this. But I saw all the furniture is there and whatnot, so I didn't really know what he was going on about. I then went inside and I noticed that my Wii U was gone, but the rest of my consoles were there. So at this point, I was already getting pretty suspicious of him. I tried to keep calm as much as I could, and I called Max to see how far from home he was. We usually both got home around the same time. As I'm calling, Dan yelled at me again that he had called the cops and that they were on their way, and in these exact words he then said, "Do whatever you need to do, because the police are on their way." When he told me that, I immediately knew he had been home for a while because he must have had time to hide all of his weapons and drugs and God knows what else he had. Within about 5 minutes, the cops were pulling in, and so was Max. One officer went upstairs with Dan and Max to write down everything that was missing, and the other officer stayed downstairs. I stayed with him, just chatting. According to Max, we're missing a lot of our stuff in our room, but Dan is only missing his PS4. I did ask him at last if it was possible to search Dan's car, and I also said if he needed to search my or Max's car, we'd be okay with it. He said it wasn't necessary, but agreed to search Dan's car. Once they all came back downstairs, the officers asked Dan if they could search his car and that they also needed his ID. He said he was okay with them searching his car, but that he had to get his ID and keys from the apartment. Max and I followed him upstairs. We saw him get his wallet and keys and he left the apartment. We don't want to be nosy and stay downstairs while they search his car, so we decided to stay in the apartment. A few minutes go by and he's still not downstairs with the cops, so we started looking around the neighborhood, but he had already vanished. How convenient, but since he had agreed that they could search his car and in no moment said that they couldn't, they went ahead and started looking if the car was unlocked, and it was. We found all of our stuff in his car. In the car was our 3DS, our PS4 controller, Max's laptop, some Wii U games, and a lot more. The very next morning, I decided to put all of his stuff out by the dumpster and then had a locksmith change our locks. I thought of putting a restraining order on him, but we ended up never going through with it. A few weeks later, we saw his car parked outside a few yards from our building, but we pretended like we didn't see him and we just watched him from our room, with 911 ready to be dialed. Eventually he just left and he didn't cause any more problems. But still, Dan, I really hope we don't encounter you ever again. So, about 3 years ago, I was going to a school in a US city, and I was living with 2 other roommates. One of my roommates was pretty well known to usually bring seedy characters back to the apartment. At one point during our fall semester, she befriended a guy in her advertising class who went by the name of Dallas. He became her weed dealer, and she would frequently bring him over to the apartment. I suspected they were sleeping together, but she always denied it. It was a strange relationship, but who am I to judge? My other roommate and I thought he was charismatic enough, but we also didn't see the appeal that Christy saw. I remember one night when we had Dallas over for dinner. He told us how he played for our college's football team and that he started his own business at the age of 25. He was a very well-known weed dealer who made a crap ton of money, and his name was Dallas because he used to live in Dallas, Texas, and apparently that's what his parents named him after. Me and my other roommate nodded our heads and listened, but we didn't think much of it except for this dude thought he was hot stuff and wanted to gloat about himself. Mind you, he was like 5'4" and probably not over 150 pounds. I believe he came over for dinner maybe about 2 more times after that. My roommate claimed that one time she decided to buy weed from him and went to his apartment off campus. When she arrived, she saw our roommate Christy just pass the crap out on a chair in the middle of the day in Dallas's apartment in some random room. When my roommate arrived, he mentioned nothing of her being there. My roommate shook her awake and Christy just woke up in a haze and basically told my roommate to screw off. My roommate recounted the story to me, and we both agreed it was pretty freaking weird, and Dallas was probably not the safest person to hang with. After a couple of months, Christy stopped hanging out with him. I remember her saying he got pissed because she didn't want to sleep with him. I also found out that a friend of hers who knew him for a long time was engaged to him. Oh, and also, his real name wasn't Dallas. I mean, real shocker there. Fast forward 2 years. Neither me or my roommate talk to Christy anymore. We're living elsewhere in said city doing our own thing. We get an alert on our phones that a girl who had just transferred to our college went missing after leaving one of the campus bars the previous night. It doesn't take very long, maybe a few days, when this huge story breaks. Apparently, this girl was killed by someone she left the bar with that night. So I get a call from my roommate, and the call goes something like this. Dude, do you remember what Dallas's real name was? Yeah, I believe it was something like Michael or something. She replies back with, go online and read this article. He freaking killed that girl who just went missing. Sure enough, I go online, and there is the most creepiest mugshot of Dallas, next to a photo of the girl he had just slain. Well, it gets crazier. Apparently he had taken her home that night. I'm assuming it was a one-night stand sort of thing. So I guess at one point things turned bad and he killed her by blunt force and strangulation. And if that isn't terrible enough for you, he cleaned up the evidence in his apartment, threw her body in a storage container, and took a freaking lift to his grandma's house hours away. And then he buried the storage container with her remains in it on the property somewhere. After obtaining a video of the 2 of them leaving the bar together, it didn't take the cops very long to find him. Weeks after that story broke, so many different girls came forward and shared similar creepy stories about Dallas. The guy who played college football and ran a successful business. You can guess that none of this was ever true. Also, he was like 28 years old, claiming he was still a student at our college when this all happened, when in reality he was probably just there prying on younger women. It's truly a horrible story what happened to that young girl.
I used to work night shift security, and by far the scariest thing I had ever encountered was when I chanced upon a robbery in progress. I was patrolling one of our assets around the start of my shift at 10 p.m. Walking around the perimeter of the building, everything looked in order, except an air conditioner near ground level that had fallen out of place. The air conditioner didn't fit well in the hole, so there had been a wooden plank to prop it up and keep it in place. I assumed that the stick had somehow been nudged and the AC unit had fallen out of place. It wasn't very heavy, so I propped the air conditioner back into its hole in the wall, positioning the stick to keep it in place. I continued my walk around the building, reaching the next window, and to my surprise, someone was there. The light in the room wasn't on, but there was a bit of light entering the room from the hallway that the office space was connected to. It wasn't uncommon for a worker to stay working late on a project, or either use their code to re-enter the building and grab something they had forgotten earlier. I pressed my face to the glass to see who it was and if I would recognize them. Once I was peering through the glass, I could make out that it definitely wasn't an office worker. The person was wearing a ski mask over their face. They noticed my face pressed up against the window and hustled out of the room. Realizing that a robbery was in progress, I quickly put two and two together, figuring out that the fallen air conditioning unit hole was most likely the way they had entered the building. I immediately pressed a button on my phone in an app that my company used to notify police if they needed to send cars to my location. I was still standing only about 100 feet away from the AC unit, so I ran over to see if that was going to be how the perpetrator would attempt to escape. Sure enough, shortly after I had reached the AC unit, it came flying out at me as the intruder pushed it forcefully from inside. The AC unit was knocked straight backwards into my chest, and I watched as the person in the ski mask flew through the hole in the wall, barreling into me and the AC unit that I had somehow managed to catch. The suspect ran into a nearby neighborhood, but the police arrived soon after and had them cornered in a city block, shutting down the entire street and eventually capturing them. It felt good to say that I had stopped an attempted robbery in progress, but I'll never forget the image of the person flying through a dark hole in the wall directly into me. It was quite terrifying, and I had nightmares about it for the next couple nights afterwards. I worked at a hotel for many years when I was younger. I eventually got promoted and earned better pay and shift hours, but when I was first working there, I was on the night shift. The night shift was from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., and the only workers in the building would be me and another person working at the front desk check-in area. The hotel wasn't a 5-star hotel by any means, but it was fairly nice, but most people we encountered and checked in the middle of the night weren't problematic. One night at about 2 a.m., a grumpy-looking middle-aged man came in asking for a hotel room for the night. We got him set up with his room, and then asked for the payment before giving him his room keys. He informed us that he wasn't able to pay currently, but would pay before he left in the morning. We clearly weren't allowed to do that, so we informed him that he could either pay for his room now, or he wouldn't be allowed to stay here. The man got quite angry and proceeded to cuss us out. The other guy I was working with that night, who was much more confrontational than I am, stepped out from behind the front desk, telling the man to leave or he'd make him leave. I was about ready to call the cops, when all of a sudden, the man took off into the hotel, running down the hallway. Both of us workers jogged out into the hallway a bit to see him enter a stairway and appeared to head downstairs towards the hotel's basement. The hotel's basement was already creepy enough as it was, being much older than the rest of the hotel and having a bunch of storage stacked high everywhere. My coworker wanted me to go down there with him, but as I said, it was already creepy enough without the possibility of a crazy man down there. I called the cops, and they came to search the basement, where they found the man hiding in the storage area with a knife in his hand. They were able to detain him without anybody getting hurt. I'm so glad that I didn't let my coworker talk me into us going down there. Who knows what the man would have done if it had only been us two to find him down there instead of a group of police officers. We didn't get any more shady characters like that during the time that I was on the night shift, but I still felt a bit relieved when I got promoted and was able to work regular hours during the daytime.
I was born and raised in North Dakota. Back when I was in high school, a group of us would research murders that occurred out in the county. We would then go out and find the scenes and film the exploration at night. It was something to do while we got wasted on shitty beer and just teenage bullshit. Eventually we ran out of places to go and got really good at finding abandoned rural farmsteads by driving dirt roads and just looking for signs. Rut roads, deliberate tree groves, and old mailbox posts were common markers. We were out looking when we spotted a tree grove that was out of place and drove through the field and discovered an old, but not too old, house. It had padlocks on the outside doors that were knocked off pretty easily. We dispatched of them and entered the kitchen. There were 6 of us, all with flashlights. and we lit up the kitchen/dining area fairly easy. The table was the initial thing that you noticed, and it was strange because of how normal it actually looked. It was set for a meal. Not a bowl was out of place. The only thing was, we'd been in dozens of these houses, and place settings were a first, especially unbroken ones. As we investigated the area, we found the fridge had the disgusting remnants of a full stock. The cupboards were full of canned and dry foods. This was definitely also a first. One guy found mail on the counter from early June 1978, and another found a creepy-ass TV guide in the living room with UFOs on the cover. All the family photos were still hanging up. Mom, dad, brother, sister, in their 1970s glory. The furniture was dusty, but in good condition. Closets were full. Everything was totally normal, which was abnormal. As we continued to dig around the house, we all started to realize that this house had not been moved out of. It had been straight up abandoned. Imagine locking the door to your house and just never coming back. That's the state this house was in. Complete, unplanned departure. We went upstairs and split into 3 pairs to check out the 3 rooms. Ours was the closest, and obviously it was the younger boy's room. I can't describe what it looked like too well because almost right away from the hall, we heard the most f***ing terrifying scream that I've ever had the misfortune of hearing. We were running down the hallway, and we're all yelling questions at one another around the same time. After a few really long seconds, the 2 screamers caught their breath and said, you have to go in and see. Walking down the hall and through the doorway. I prayed that I wouldn't act like a pussy in front of my friends. I shouldn't have been concerned, because the others were as scared as I was. The room itself opened up, and to the left of the doorframe, and centered on the right side of the room, was a queenish-sized bed, propped up on the pillows with the blanket drawn to the waist, arms on top of the blanket, and worst of all, the head was turned slightly, so it was looking you straight in the eyes when you entered the room. It was a life-size porcelain doll. Snow-white skin, jet black hair, cold, dead eyes. The dead eyes lit up our flashlights, like she was waiting for us. If the head hadn't been turned, I could excuse it, but it was turned, ready for you when you walked in. Ready for 20 years. Hasty fucking exits were made down those stairs and back into our car. It was during the ride we started to get even more creeped out, because we realized that even though the house had been abandoned, someone had taken the time to set up that goddamn doll. Not packing food, clothes, or family photos. Setting up the doll was one of the last things done in this house. We researched their names, but got nothing. No tragic car accident, no grisly massacre, no extended family. Just a tacky time capsule in the middle of nowhere. We found out that the county had been taking possession of the land for non-payment of taxes, explaining the locks. Never tracked down any more information on what happened to them, or why they left that fucking doll.